Welcome to Two Teachers and a Table. We are your hosts. I'm Mr. Ripka and this is Mr. Bergman. Today our topic is national epics. Before we begin with the question, I'd like to give some surrounding definitions perhaps of what a national epic is. The original epic, of course, is Homer's Iliad. And this one, of course, was written or spoken, let's say, in 800 BC. After this, and that is the national epic of Greece. After this, we have Virgil's Aeneid. Of course, that's the national epic of Italy. Another national epic of Italy would be Dante's Divine Comedy. And then the last of the great national epics would, of course, be John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is the national epic of England. So having given 5 examples of what national epics are, I'd like to ask Mr. Bergman if America has a national epic.
It's interesting, Mr. Ripka, that you should mention that in talking about, first of all, the American literary tradition that had to develop in this nation as a nation, English-speaking nation separate from England. The United States did not even have a novel until the early 19th century, when a Quaker novelist wrote a novel by the name of Whelan in Pennsylvania. And prior to that time, most of our novels were set in areas that were very reminiscent of England.
Were they trying? Were they trying to mimic a sort of English novel?
Absolutely. And Whelan by Charles Brockden Brown, the Quaker, was used more of a Gothic background. He was talking about the area around what would have been the country around Philadelphia, which was then, of course, a much smaller city. But he alludes to classicism. The wealthy family in there has a gazebo that is sort of like a little Greek temple on their estate where these actions take place. And then the rest of it sort of reads on is almost a psychological conundrum as to what's going on. It's all based on human psychology. But again, our traditions come from Europe. You can even see, the Gothic horror of the United States is a story like the Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe is a good example. You have a story that's written by an American writer, but it takes place in a setting that's obviously Gothic England.
If I may interject, do any of these writers, are they attempting to write an epic of the country? For instance, Virgil was, of course, commissioned by Augustus for that purpose. That is, Augustus wanted a national epic, and so Virgil, of course, went and back to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and sort of mimicked what Homer kind of had done and combined that into Virgil's Aeneid. Are any of the authors attempting to do such a thing at this time that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that they were, because one thing I have to say about some of the United States' or America's earliest novels is the fact that a lot of the main characters don't necessarily represent epic-type heroes. They're very memorable characters. They're very significant characters. They're very the protagonists are deliberately put in their positions to do what they have to do. But
perhaps we could define what a epic hero is, then, if you want to do that.
Well, yeah, an epic hero tends to be on a quest of some sort. He has usually an epic hero will have some remarkable divine qualities about them. And some epics, even going back to Gilgamesh, you have a character who's part god and part human.
Achilles, who has divine wrath
and
is partly god, partly human.
Exactly, the evolution of Sumerian or Babylonian epics reach Greece, so it's no doubt that they influence that as well.
And even Odysseus has divine cunning, shall we say?
Absolutely. But what's interesting is when you look at American literature, even though they're written during the classical times, they're still desperately searching for an American identity in an American location. And I think one of the first that you run into, but it still doesn't have an epic hero, what I would consider an epic hero, is the Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter that was truly American. It can only be American simply by the fact that you're dealing with the Puritan mindset, how it operated in New England. And of course, so the romanticism, though, that he's using to portray the setting is still reminiscent of what the British are doing at the time.
Oh, wow.
So, but the setting is uniquely American. It's really, you definitely start getting American literature when you get into American realism and naturalism.
Which is, for instance, what sort of novel?
If you were dealing with Frank Norris, McTeague would be a good example of that. Even Faulkner, any works by Faulkner.
So moving away from the romantic idea of what America is into the sort of reality of America.
Exactly.
I see.
So I think that before America could come up with an epic of its own, it had to come up with a literary identity of its own.
Oh, that's fascinating, because I guess the suggestion there is that Greece already had an identity.
Absolutely.
And so then the epic came out of the identity. Italy already had an identity, the epic came out of the identity. England already had an identity, the epic came out of the identity. We, in our burgeoning years, did not have an identity, a solidified identity.
Absolutely.
I see. Once we did start understanding our identity, you're suggesting that an epic did arise, though, eventually.
I certainly think one did, if I want to say it that way. Now, remember, traditional epics were generally written in verse. And naturally, you're not going to have that in an American literary tradition, especially in the 20th century. In 1925, I truly believe that epic arose in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby.
The Great Gatsby.
Absolutely. And the reason why I think is, first of all, you're dealing with a hero who is surrounded by a magnanimous, not even a personality, but a mystique. Even though he's not, we find out at the end that he's not, he didn't portray himself at all as to what he was. People believed he was great. Some of the stories that the guests at his parties would tell about him were outrageous as to how much control, how much power he had, even to the point where his estate was so well disguised it was actually a yacht, and the whole estate could just float away, that it was just docked, his mansion was docked up at his...
I just want to make sure, because it's been a while since I've read that. And are you saying that my memory misleads me, that it was a mansion, but it was a mansion on a yacht?
No, well, that's what the rumor was.
The rumor, right. I see.
So,
okay.
right,
the rumor
they just came up with these outlandish rumors about him. And that was one of them.
I did read that there was other titles for the book at one point, and one of them was, I think, Under the Red, White, and Blue, or something like that. Have you ever heard of this idea?
Not
but well, I just bring it up because it seems to support what you're saying, that he is attempting, perhaps, to write some sort of national epic.
Well, where I think the nationalism comes from, first of all, it was the 1920s. And in the 1920s, the United States, because of flaming youth and whatever, just achieved a culture that was unique in the world. For the first time, we were anti-academic. Our college traditions, or universities, if you look at the founding of Harvard and Yale, they're still these very traditional, upright places that represent the epitome of behavior and education, academic standard. When you get into the 1920s, especially when young people are reading about college life, and again, as Scott Fitzgerald, not even a student himself at that particular time, he was actually older than the people he was writing about or writing to. He gave us an idea. He probably created the idea of a college that was, there for a lot of fun.
Really?
Yes. And
the idea is that, which a lot of people think, I go to college and I'm going to have a great time, join a fraternity.
That's where it came from. It came from the 20s.
Wow.
You know, the amount
which is part of
parties.
Our identity, really.
Right.
Huh?
Exactly, in fraternity life. And the United States, it also is unique because how the United States dealt with the Depression. You know, that you have a bootlegger in here. That the whole thing is settled around people becoming rich off of illegal activities or alcohol being involved that rich people have access to, even though it's illegal. And so, and it's uniquely American with our mobs and because of Prohibition. And I said Depression. I'm sorry, I meant Prohibition.
That's fine.
Yeah, with Prohibition. And Prohibition, or the reaction that Prohibition, Americans had to Prohibition is unique. It created a whole decade of slang that was different, clothing that was different, behavior that was different, ideas of what was considered successful. No longer was the intelligent college professor, the considered the esteem of what people wanted to be. That was considered dowdy and old fashioned. The flashier you were, the quicker you could make money, the more successful you were considered.
Wow.
Which is why Hollywood stars, before the 1920s, when people were in movies, they're the silent movies of the early times. They weren't stars. They weren't paid well. They lived in little bungalows or whatever. And finally, they became the role model for what was considered success. And as a result, then they could command a certain amount of money, and they became wealthy, and their lifestyle became not only sought after, but young people wanted to emulate it.
Wow.
And so suddenly we end up with a culture now that's worthy of a hero that represents that. And Gatsby is the perfect example of someone who represents that culture. Now, he's associated with high living, that had to do with good food, good drink, whatever. Of course, we find out, he's from very humble, poor backgrounds. He struggled most of his life.
Do you think this is part of the American identity too? That is, let me put forth an identity that's not really true about who I am, but I will put this forth, and the surface, the superficial identity will be flashy enough that people will believe it.
Right.
I mean, do you think that's part of the suggestion of what the identity is? The image
became more important than what was there. And as long as you could keep the image up, it didn't matter. I'm sure that, throughout history has always been the way things were. I mean, Machiavelli, writes about, the fact that even though your intentions can be one thing, but your image can be another. Yeah. But, we have Gatsby, who generally is successful in creating this image, and it's perpetuated not by him as much as it is by those who watch what he does, which makes him a hero, because he is emulated, he is copied, he's looked up to as being this wonderful mystery person that everybody has a different story about him. Everybody interprets him differently.
Almost like a rock star, a movie star.
Right.
Everybody has a different interpretation of
and they're all wrong.
And they're all wrong.
Yeah,
they're all
wrong.
Wrong.
He's the Wizard of Oz. He's the man behind the curtain.
I see.
Pulling the levers and all. But he's has created an image.
And is Gatsby perpetuating this image on purpose? Also, it's not by accident.
Yes. Well, that's in a way he can impress, and that's the other point. Most of the time, in an epic, traditionally, the hero is on a quest. Right. And we know that Gatsby's on a quest. He wants to re-win or the love of his life, who has established a new life away from him, is married, has a child, is married, has money, is married to money, so she doesn't need to be married to be wealthy. And he needs to find a way to impress her. He thinks that money's going to impress her.
It's a love lost story.
Yeah, there you go.
And trying to find it again or re-win her through any means possible, and through this means at this time through the image that he can put forth of being rich, successful, giving feasts to people, parties.
Right. Yeah. And the fact that he's gained a certain amount of fame, notoriety, if you will, by the stories that people tell about him.
And the stories could get around to her.
Right. Exactly.
And then she'll hear about him. And then she'll perhaps wish that she were back with him again.
Right, yeah, because suddenly that's something very exciting.
I see, yeah.
The reality hits both of them about who they, both Gatsby and Daisy.
Can you explain that a little?
Yeah.
That's the woman he's trying to win again.
Right, they finally are able to re-meet each other. Her cousin sets up the date, and they re-meet, and you assume that they're exercising an affair to some degree. The book is not specific as to what affair, but the whole thing comes to a head when all parties are together at a hotel in New York, which includes her husband, her best friend, her cousin, and Gatsby. And finally, everything is out in the open.
So all the images, the superficial presentation of who they are trying to at least pretend they are, falls down and collapses, and the reality is there.
Right.
And what is the reality then?
The reality is that Gatsby has achieved a certain amount of wealth, but he's new money. And he achieved it through an illegal means, through bootlegging. And her husband, who's wealthy, even though he's a terrible person, he's brutal, he lies, he cheats on his wife, he abuses his wife physically, he's still considered the preferable gentleman because he's from older money. And he represent, and even though he's just as much of a sham as Gatsby, he's able to hide behind an old boys club that protects that, and Gatsby doesn't have that.
He has nothing to hide behind anymore now that the reality is there.
Gatsby can't even his best friend. He has one best friend, Meyer Wolfsheim, that he can't hide behind because Meyer Wolfsheim knows exactly who he is and could expose him in a minute, but admires that rise from nothing to something simply by his own willingness to be a part of this. But however, when Gatsby is dead at the end of the novel, Meyer Wolfsheim won't even go to the funeral. Because he has this attitude that you only admire people when they're alive. So when he was alive, he could hide under all that stuff. Dead, he's exposed to what he is. And he's not interested in the real Gatsby. He's interested in the image. We found his name's not even Gatsby. His name is Jay Gatz.
Oh, wow. So, everything about this guy has been faking, is created.
So, therefore he's on this quest, this amazing quest. However, he's not armed, unlike, Achilles, who, has his, helmet and, weapons and whatever. Gatsby's his aren't real. He's Don Quixote sort of makes fun of a quest.
I kind of wondered if Don Quixote wasn't a Spanish epic in a way.
Exactly.
In a way that you're saying that makes fun of it at the same time as being the Spanish epic.
Yes.
In a way.
Because Gatsby is Don Quixote, but the tone is different. That's all. The tone of Don Quixote we tend to take humorously.
Right.
As a satire. But
Cervantes seems to be making fun in a way of these romantic novels that Don Quixote has read,
and you could,
but at the same time, Cervantes does seem in a way to respect his character Don Quixote. He does seem like there's something that this guy, is doing that's interesting.
Think about who the respect comes from. Sancho.
It comes from Sancho.
Yeah, because Sancho will not, even though Sancho can see for himself the fraudulent nature, he still is the servant and has to respect.
Yeah, what's the funny, interesting thing about that story too is those two characters. Last time I read it, I realized they kind of switch. By the end of the story, Don Quixote becomes a little more realistic,
and Sancho is lost.
And Sancho has started to become a Don Quixote. He's getting lost in the sort of romanticism of being, a knight, or for him, being a page or a servant.
Right, and if we could parallel that, think about Gatsby. He's trying to appear like a white knight because he's going to deliver Daisy from her abusive husband that doesn't love her, according to him, and that's his take on it. She never said that.
This leads me to one more question, at least one more question about Great Gatsby specifically. That is, when the heroes are on these journeys, and if I remember correctly, a lot of them take trips to the underworld. Though Achilles doesn't take a trip to the underworld per se, when Priam visits Achilles in Book 24 of the Iliad, he is taken there by Hermes, who, of course, is the god that guides people to the underworld. And where is Priam going? But, of course, to Achilles' hut to pick up his dead son, Hector. So that's a metaphorical trip to the underworld. In the Odyssey, Odysseus takes a trip to the underworld.
Gilgamesh does too.
Gilgamesh does too, right? I keep forgetting about good old Gilgamesh, which is older even than the Iliad.
He's the father
of all epics. And then when we get to Divine Comedy, I mean, that's like the whole Inferno is a trip into the underworld. Yeah, and then, of course, when we get to the English epic, Paradise Lost, there's the Satan is a character, and he, of course, is thrown into the underworld, and there are scenes set in the underworld, too. And Don Quixote, though he doesn't go into the underworld, he goes into a cave, this sort of cave at one scene, and he has these visions, and he comes back out of the cave. It's a metaphorical underworld trip on their voyage, of course. So I guess I'm wondering. I wanted to ask: in Great Gatsby, is there any metaphorical trip to the underworld that you've found?
I would say that there is.
Yeah.
We find out now. We learn most about Gatsby after he's deceased in the book. Nick Carraway, the narrator, gives us information after speaking with people, and Gatsby's father comes to visit at the end of the novel because he's at the funeral.
Oh, okay.
And he reveals a little bit more. But we do learn that before Gatsby achieved any fame, he had, first of all, his youth was not particularly good because his parents, they were farmers and they were poor farmers. And they were bad farmers. They were poor because they were not effective farmers.
I see.
So, he had that. But there's a part where after he gets back from the military, before he can rise to his fame where he wants to be, or his level of wealth to impress Daisy, he goes to work for a man who you assume is somehow or other involved in organized crime. Okay. And during that time, he works really low jobs. He becomes a clam digger, for instance, which is a good example of his personal hell that he goes through.
He reaches the nadir in a way, right? And many times for these stories, they come out different,
right? And that's exactly
how
he will. He works as a valet on the man's yacht, and eventually, though, the man throws him a number of bones, and he takes advantage of it because just like hell gave them the advantage of learning something, Gilgamesh, receives. I can't even remember the detail because it's told so many different ways, but Gilgamesh, when visiting the underworld, receives information that he needs to go to further his journey.
And Odysseus is warned by Agamemnon, when you get home, make sure you dress up to test your wife, because when I got home, Agamemnon, that is, my wife killed me.
Right. Exactly.
And then, of course, Dante, when he gets out, he has seen all the sins and the punishments. And so he realizes how not to act.
Right.
Of course, he needs to go through purgatory and through Paradiso to see God himself also. But yeah, they seem to come out having learned something vital.
Yeah.
Vital.
So he was in this very subservient or very, working poor menial jobs, then in a subservient situation. And then he was thrown enough, like I said, bones or information that he himself was able to get associated with organized crime and use it to bring himself up. He found whatever method he could. I mean, that's not the American way. Nothing is. We have some industries in this country which, shall remain unnamed here, where people have made tons and tons of money off of very illegitimate behavior, illegal behavior. Yeah. And some of it as well, it's legal. And it's
just shady.
It's illegal. It's legal, but it's shady. It was illegal, but it's not now because of that. Because people have made money off of it, and some people have even achieved not only success but have no problem in showing their faces. we know for a fact, that some of these millionaires have not achieved, or billionaires have not achieved their money.
And maybe like they're even proud of it or something.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, I got away with it, or I was smart enough to know how to use the system.
Or again, they're using Gatsby techniques and they have it hidden. We know it, but we don't see it, or we don't think about it when we see them. But this is, we look at certain wealthy families in this country, and if you look back, we know that they have bootlegging in their family and a lot of other things.
Yeah. So we have a couple of things, and we have a journey for an epic that Great Gatsby is going on. We have the at least a metaphorical trip to the underworld for Great Gatsby. Are there any other elements of the epic that you can think of that connect this? Yeah,
that I love, because we talk about verse.
Yes.
And in the Great Gatsby, as in Scott Fitzgerald does in a lot of his books, he will take popular songs from the time and put the lines in there. Somebody is hearing a song at one of his parties or whatever. One is the Sheik of Araby. Okay. I believe that Daisy's singing it or something in the car. And a few other songs. So you do have verse.
Are these jazz songs?
Yes, they would have been popular
songs
jazz songs. Popular dance songs at the time. One too, I think it's from his novel, This Side of Paradise. It's Ring Around the Moon, Jelly on a Spoon. So he has these little verses, and they're significant to what he's trying to say. They're saying something about the climate of the time, the way, like the Sheik of Araby is about a man stealing away a woman, and it's in a tent at night.
I see.
This Gatsby sees himself as a sheik, and that
his woman had been taken away from him.
There was a movie. The song was actually inspired by a movie with Rudolph Valentino that was popular in the 20s, and he was the leading man on screen. He was handsome and masculine. And the boys who went to see his movie started to wear their hair like his, a lot of grease in it. Patent leather hair, they called it. They gritted their teeth when they met their girlfriends.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because from my understanding, in Greek education, the Iliad and the Odyssey were used primarily as a grammar book, but also a story of morals and a story, just various fabulous stories and the story of the gods and things like this. But the boys would always be asked, who do you want to be like? Do you want to be like Achilles, or do you want to be like Odysseus? Almost like they were, as you're saying, mimicked, right? And then they would grab swords and go be like Achilles, or practice rhetoric and go be like Odysseus.
And it's interesting you should say that too, because that's what you had. Like I said, the only reason why he included that song, because it was very popular. Young people would be reading it. Rudolph Valentino was a hero, and Gatsby is a tragic hero, if you want to even call him that. He's a tragic hero who also wanted to emulate the popular image of the time. He was no different than any other.
Could I ask you perhaps why we would call Mr. Gatsby there a tragic hero?
Well, he's a tragic hero because he suffered. People look at it, he suffered for a higher ideal, and the ideal is love. But when we look at Gatsby, we find that Gatsby is so immature. He's emotionally immature. He's a 16-year-old.
Some would say Achilles was too.
Yeah.
In a way.
He was, completely self-absorbed. Daisy was the when the greyhound catches the rabbit on a track and it won't run anymore.
Right.
And Gatsby would have turned into that. He wanted to chase. He wanted to flatter himself to be appreciated by a class that never accepted him. Daisy says to him early in the novel, when she knows him as an officer in the military, and maybe his World War I experience was hell as well, even though if it's emulating F. Scott Fitzgerald's, his was not, because he never got outside of the camp where he did his training.
That makes sense.
He wanted to, come back to World War I hero, but he didn't. Gatsby said that he did. He had some kind of medal, but it's, questionable. As to exactly what he faced, but
but that could be another metaphorical hell for him, that war experience.
Exactly.
I could see that.
But so right, he again, I have to be some kind of a hero, a war hero. So the hero wins the prize.
No,
and Achilles is a good example.
It's funny that you bring up the woman too. I'm thinking now of all these epics, and you got Achilles with Briseis, who's taken away, and he wants her back.
And starts a fight.
It starts a fight because of it. Odysseus is trying to get back to Penelope. Dante, of course, has Beatrice that he is sort of triggering this whole trip up here. Even with Paradise Lost, it's Adam and Eve. A sort of relationship too. It's interesting to think of the theme love in all of these epics too. In addition, that the Iliad is a story of anger, and so forth. But you're right, there's love in there, right? Yeah.
And Gatsby has, he has his confrontation with Tom.
Okay.
They almost get into a fist fight. They actually have their hands clenched, ready to go. And Daisy stops it by her behavior.
And if I may, and I could be wrong here, but I just want for most of the epics that I'm aware of, there is this divine quality to it. There's a god or a goddess or something like this. Now, for the Great Gatsby, when I see the book on the shelf, I see these two eyeballs on the. The cover I'm talking about. It has like a car is driving down the street, and there's these two eyeballs looking at that. Oh, are you aware of what those two eyeballs are about?
Well, it's the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which is a sign, a billboard advertising for an oculist, as they called him in New York.
The eye doctor or something?
Yeah, and really just somebody at the time who sold glasses.
Oh, okay.
How well they could fit you for it. He called him a wag of an oculist.
That doesn't sound like he's very good.
Yeah, because he went out of business, and all that's left of the billboard is the eyes with glasses. And it's interesting because in the movie, the 1974 movie, they really emphasized the character Myrtle Wilson, she and her husband on a garage.
I've seen that one.
Right, in the shadow of the sign.
Yeah.
And he's looking out. She's having an affair with Daisy's husband.
Okay.
And her husband knows she's having an affair, not with whom at the time. And he's looking out, and he's looking at the billboard, and he says, he can see you, Myrtle. He knows what you're doing. And she says, that's an advertisement. You're so dumb, you don't know you're alive. But he sees that as the eyes of God watching over him. And so they draw that idea. And I guess that the novel insinuates the same idea. But what's interesting, too, there's an episode where Daisy and Gatsby are alone together in Gatsby's house with Nick. Nick's there, and Nick he's the narrator, so we don't know what happens when they're alone without him. So they're together with him, and Daisy looks outside. It had been raining. She looks outside. The rain has stopped, and there's clouds. And she says, look at that big pink cloud out there. I just want to put you inside of it and push you around.
What does that mean?
I love that.
It's a great image.
Yeah, and right, you put him in heaven. That God, he's up on the clouds.
You've deified him.
Yeah, and where I think that F. Scott Fitzgerald got the idea from? His wife Zelda was an amateur artist, and she made a set of paper dolls. And the paper dolls, she made a paper dolls of the family. And the paper doll of F. Scott Fitzgerald, he has wings.
Oh, wow.
So she regarded her.
He's using sort of her art in a way his art.
He plagiarized off her terribly. Most of his ideas came from things that she had suggested or had even written in her diary, according to.
Does he give credit to her at all, or no? Of course,
not at all.
Of course not. I wonder who Homer plagiarized and did not give credit to, and so forth.
And so right, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, he is Gatsby. He also could not break into that society and had a number of sham aspects about himself, or that he was working on. He wanted to be the football hero in college, and he was too small to make the team. He wanted to be the World War I hero, but the war ended before he had a chance to go overseas. And then how do you strike it big? And then he became a novel. But, he tried to come across as a responsible husband and father and all. And, he drank excessively. A struggle with alcohol in his life. It's probably what led to his...
Didn't Gatsby not drink?
And that's the neat thing about yes, that he happens to create a character who doesn't drink. Yeah. And yet the hypocrisy makes it worse because he's a bootlegger. So the fact that, it's all right for you to poison yourself off of this bootleg hooch, but I don't touch it.
It's like the bartender, who doesn't drink, but serves
or the pusher.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I guess the bartender who does drink might get a little sloppy behind the bar anyway.
Or they're they have access to it all the time and they could abuse it.
Yeah.
And so Gatsby was not going to put himself in that position.
Wow.
And yet, ironically, Nick, who puts him down for being a bootlegger, produces alcohol throughout the book.
I was curious about the narrator to this book.
The narrator. Nick. They're always there. Tom, Nick. They're always having drinks, no matter where they are.
And as you mentioned, with the narrator, when he's not around, we don't know what's going on with Gatsby or anybody. It's all seen through Nick, the narrator's viewpoint. He has to be there. Is he a reliable? Would you call him a reliable narrator?
I don't think he's reliable at all because first of all, Nick is real insecure at the beginning of the book. He has to assure you that he has morals and that his father verifies that. My father always told me, and I've always taken that advice. And then you find, no, you didn't. You had an opportunity to have the life that you were choosing at the time, or to move up how you wanted to move up, and you decided to let yourself get distracted by wealthy people who were playing games, and you became a part of it. You thought that was going to rise you to society by being in there and hobnobbing with them, but all you did was get caught in their web, and you became an instrumental part in causing the death of a man. It's Nick Carraway that set up the meeting between Gatsby and Daisy. And even though he knew, she was a married woman and was his cousin, and he had no right to put himself in that situation he should have told Gatsby, no, that's, if you're the big powerful man, you can arrange for a meeting with a woman. You can meet any woman you want. You can have, and they sort of hint at that. You could have any woman you want. Why are you pursuing this married woman?
Yeah,
who rejected you at one time?
Yeah, and all these themes that we're talking about, they seem still to be relevant with the identity of what it means to be an American. The book is still taught. Movies continue to come out. With different various editions of the movie, various actors. One was in 3D a couple years ago with all the new technology. So the idea that this story is indeed the American national epic does make sense to me. It makes a lot of sense. Are there any other qualities of the epic that we would like to add to this at all? I'm trying to think of the various elements that make up an epic. And we know, of course, we had verse, voyage or journey, trip to the underworld. Some nationalism in there, capturing the identity of a country. And and so is there anything else before we kind of wrap up the show here for today?
For Gatsby, that pretty much covers it.
That pretty much covers it. Well, I like that. Well, thank you for joining us for Two Teachers and a Table today, and we will see you next week.